Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Christina Joby Maria. Yeah, I'm a junior consultant at Turner& Townsend, and we are joined today by Abby Slade, who is a senior consultant from Turner& Townsend. The purpose of the event is that this is a retrofit information, support, and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner& Townsend. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I will now hand over to Abby Slade to start today's presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Christina. And I am a senior consultant at Turner and Townsend. I've been part of the RISE team for coming up to 2.5 years now, involved in various capacities. And I'm also a SPOC, so a single point of contact for SHDF Wave 2.1 projects, essentially helping to provide some delivery assurance on their projects as well. So today we're going to be looking at effective storytelling for housing retrofit. So really the purpose of today is going to be looking at how we tell our stories about retrofit, when we're communicating them out, and how we communicate these to our key stakeholders, whether that's residents, whether that's colleagues, whether that's kind of senior leadership in our organization. We talk you through, how to identify who those stakeholders are, and also the kind of key messaging that you want to be sharing when you're reaching out to them and sharing about your project. So we lean into the kind of storytelling metaphor quite hard here for this presentation. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to talk through kind of making connections. We've got a bit of a case study as well, and then discussing how you kind of apply those to your project and your story. So really what we're doing today is going to think about the tools that we need to forge partnerships and relationships with your stakeholders, and by helping you to tell the story of local play-based projects, how to identify blockers to change, and ultimately put people at the heart of the solution. So as I said, we're kind of following a storytelling analogy for this presentation. So the characters here are really telling the story of local projects. The cynics are the kind of blockers to your project. And we talk about the kind of happy ever after or the solution, which is ultimately the outcomes for tenants. So as a bit of an introduction, effective storytelling is crucial for retrofit projects. It comes in at all stages of the project. For some, you might be lucky and it's a big priority for your organisation, and senior leadership and all your colleagues are fully bought in. But for a lot of people, they need some element of storytelling to help, pull people into the project, to convince them that the project is worthwhile. Or even with tenants, just if there's certain tenants that aren't on board, it's making sure you can connect with them effectively. So as I've already said, this masterclass will look to build stakeholder relationships, to address some of those key blockers, and prioritize people in the solutions. So we've got a bit of a diagram here which looks at kind of storytelling in a visual capacity. So kind of the main three elements that feed into your storytelling is the narrative firstly. So what is the story? What is the information that we're currently trying to share? The next thing that really goes into it and is a real pillar is the data. So this could be variety, this could be, EPC scores, this could be the results of an asset management review, this could be data on kind of tenant health and well-being, and how impacted people are by damp and mold. And also what kind of feeds into this is the visuals. So you have your story, how are you going to tell it? And how you're going to really showcase the findings that you found. So in terms of the overlaps here, we've got, enlighten, engage, explain. But really the main thing that we're trying to get here is to affect some kind of change. So if you think about a time where you had to tell a story either within work or outside of it, did the other person really listen and understand what you were saying? So we can use storytelling to kind of show you data, and for our retrofit projects this is going to be a really key part of that communication piece. So we can kind of talk about, in terms of storytelling, who are the characters, because within any project there'll be a whole range of people involved. All of the people that are involved will have a different opinion, and they will all need to be kind of considered in your project. You may not be able to go along with all of them, it may not even be possible to, but it's important to kind of consider all of the different range of voices within the project. So in terms of some of the characters, we've got occupants, so these are the tenants, these might be their children, it could be the future generations of people that live in the properties, and kind of considering how improvement will bring about a benefit to these people. This may be also kind of a bit more external, so things like contractors, operatives, internal maintenance teams. So also thinking about how your project will impact them. Is a new technology involved? Have they worked on this estate before? Have they worked with this measure mix before? And what has been some of the kind of key feedback on previous projects? We then think about locations, so the location of tenants. What kind of buildings are we looking at? Is it flats? Is it bungalows? How many is involved? Is it 50 properties or is it 500? Might be different messaging depending on the scale of the project. And lastly, it's what works are being proposed. So is it something that's known about? Is it something that the stakeholders are aware of? For example, you might be looking at a kind of new technology for your project. Is there knowledge of failure with this particular works in previous projects? That might be something that has to be woven into your story. So language is also really important. So both in terms of the vocabulary, but the language that's used when you're communicating with your stakeholders. So if some of you have attended, some of our previous masterclasses, you might have already seen this slide before. And essentially it shows a bit of a shift in language that we're using to describe retrofit. So we want to make sure that we're using language that's accessible for tenants and for other stakeholders, and really speaks to the things that matter to them. So I've spoken to a fair few housing providers recently, and a lot are kind of really looking to shift their language to speak to the things that matter to their tenants. So instead of using things like retrofit and decarbonisation, which isn't always kind of readily known terminology, a lot of kind of moving to things like home upgrades, warmer homes, cheaper bills, really tapping into the things that matter to their residents. So as I said, for some it might be around bills, for others warmth, for others they might be very house proud, and it's all around kind of having a nice looking home and those improvement works. So it's important that retrofit isn't just something that happens to tenants, and that they really feel like they've been brought on this journey and feel like their needs have been considered. So also in terms of language, it's important to discuss, how we communicate and how we get that across. So for example, for some tenants, English may not be their first or even second language. So you want to make sure that they are still kind of brought into the process and still understanding your communications. So understanding tenants and kind of how best to do this can be a challenge, but it also can be an opportunity as well. So previously hard to reach tenants can be supported through the use of documents, communications, in a language which they understand. You could also consider kind of protected characteristics here. So you might consider how to address certain disabilities. This might consider things like having some communications going out to in Braille or being audio described. So you want to make sure that your retrofit project is really kind of linked in with your equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. In terms of making connections, so when you're kind of making connections for your story, you can start by kind of identifying those characters. So you can find local projects in your area where you can build connections. For example, this could be kind of an in progress or completed project. For example, has there been already a heat pump installation program that you can kind of tap into for this? You can think about who is involved, so who are going to be the key people for your project, whether they're kind of known to everyone, are they new to the team or to the organization, and who is going to be or who really is key to the success of your project. So there's a few examples here of how you can build connections, and again it's things like case studies, finding local projects, a colleague from this masterclass, and really kind of using your network to tap into who those characters are. So it's important to understand the characters. To think about what their journey is, what's important to the characters, as we've already discussed, and potentially whether they're kind of vulnerable tenants as well. So you can think about, when you're thinking about your characters, you can think about what their priorities are. For example, do they have something unique about their house that is going to be important to address? Do they have any children or caring responsibilities? What were some of the key blockers? How were they managed? Who was involved, within the story? And then also, what was the outcome? What has been learned? Was more or less engagement needed? And how have you embedded some of those lessons learned for kind of future projects as well? Moving on now to, I guess, a slightly negative. So you can have a think about who are the cynics of the project. And by this, we mean kind of what are some of the kind of main blockers to the project? So were there any conflicts or issues that were addressed? Was there a particular person or kind of job role that was a main blocker? Um, was it something a bit less tangible? So was it the language that was used that kind of prevented project success? Or was it a lack of understanding on behalf of the tenants? Were there trust issues which meant that you didn't get the outcome that you wanted? And you can also think about, how was this managed? Was it even managed effectively? And has there been a kind of positive outcome for the project? It's important to think about whether this blocker still exists, and also to have a think about were opinions change, and if so, how was this achieved in the end? And then we can think about kind of that happy ever after. What was the solution? So how did the project turn out in the end? Did it meet its criteria? For example, were you thinking about the meeting, EPC ratings for the project? Do you have any stats on things like tenant satisfaction? Were there a higher number of refusals than you wanted? Were there any kind of groups of properties that you thought of as being hard to access? You can also think here about whether there are any compromises in meeting that solution. So, ways of working with your characters to make sure that there's a good outcome for all. So, in terms of a bit of a case study here, so we've got a case study here that was given in by Home Group. So they were looking to target to retrofit the worst rated EPC rated property portfolio. So really looking at that kind of worst first approach. They found that the COVID pandemic really affected the ability to work in client homes, and it meant that it was hard to maintain client communications. So they found, for example, that of the 90 homes that they were looking at for this case study, they had around 98 that were signed up initially, and they did start to get, a further few agreeing halfway through the program. But it was important to think about, how they could go about bringing in some additional tenants that were kind of from those harder to reach areas. So in terms of the lessons learnt, so they had a bit of kind of feedback to see what were some of the barriers for this project. And there's a couple of kind of reasons that were given here that the home group have used to kind of feed into the rest of their project. So the first one that they've got is that people generally don't have enough information to make an informed choice. And also they hear things from kind of friends and family or in the media of greening their homes. So things like the high installation and running costs, complicated and costly tech, and also the disruption to their homes. So it's important that we're recognizing that this is, a key barrier to retrofit. And this is something it's important to not assume, some of the barriers to your tenants, but really speaking to them to find out what some of these barriers are. It's why it's sometimes beneficial when you're looking to pull together a project to really pull in some of those kind of pillar of the community people, because often people find, and it was the case for this project as well, that even though people might sign up initially or might be a bit more reticent to sign up, once they start to hear that their neighbours are having the works, and actually they say, I was really worried about these elements, but we found that they've actually not come to fruition. My home is warmer, it's more comfortable, my bills are cheaper, and it's not as complicated as I thought. It can really help bring people on board, and that really did work from this project. Some other kind of lessons here. In terms of kind of the outcome, we've got one customer told us that their monthly bills have gone from £7 per day to 70p per day. This pilot also resulted in some customers becoming green champions. So early engagement with the customers and internal teams was really key for this project. And as I said, having those kind of champions within the community that can, speak to their neighbours. So it's important to look at what others have done and to really learn from the mistakes. And also, as Home Group did here, really learn from retrofit pilots to find out what some of the kind of key concerns are from residents and help to address them. Some other kind of key lessons that the home group submitted were things like starting your surveying as soon as possible to really start speaking to your tenants and get an idea of what measures are going into their programme, early engagement with the DNO. It's important to appoint a lead for the programme to maintain progress, but also have a single point of contact there. And also look at both the internal and external mistakes of other programmes to really help mitigate some of the problems before they even arise. So we can look now about applying that to your project. So it's worth, as we're kind of going through this point, thinking, especially if you've got a project coming up, a lot of you on the call might have applied for one of the Warm Homes grants, and you might have a project that's kind of in the pipeline due to be launched, very shortly for mobilization. If you do, I'd encourage you to really think about that project for this next stage and kind of applying this all to your project in particular. So in terms of kind of your project or a project that you've got coming up, or maybe I should have said you've already recently delivered a project and you're looking at how to best tell the story of that project. So when you're thinking about applying this, you want to consider all of the characters that are involved, and who all of the major stakeholders are. So this might be internally, so things like your senior teams, your colleagues, your maintenance teams, contractors, thinking about how this impacts them. And externally, some of these characters might be tenants, community groups, social services, food banks. You need to think about who do you have to sell your story to. So what is your elevator pitch? Can you capture the essence of the project, if given 3 minutes in a project? Not sure what's going on with the lights in here. You can also think about who's on your side, so who some of your allies are, who's already supporting you, for example, your line manager, your colleagues, etc. But who do you have to convince, or who do you have to sell to? So who isn't on board already, or potentially needs some help with kind of reframing the story in a more positive way? You can think about who's already in your network, so potentially, net zero hubs, other housing providers that have similar projects, some local community groups, or some local research institutes as well. And you can also think about whether there are any other projects in the area that you can use as a baseline. So any other kind of similar projects that help to kind of illustrate the important points from yours. It's got here, understanding the dynamics of your project is really crucial. So again, thinking about your project, who are some of the cynics of your project? Again, you can think about some of the same stakeholders that you thought about already. So internally, are there any kind of colleagues, any senior leadership that you really need to look to convince? Are there any tenants that are kind of nervous about the project, or any particular groups of tenants that are hard to reach? You can think at this point about how you manage this, so having a targeted plan for each, potentially. And again, you can look to see if there's any kind of local project that you can use as a case study, anyone that's kind of dealt with similar blockers or cynics that you're finding. So it's got here, recognizing obstacles is crucial. You want to identify the cynics blocking progress, and find strategies to manage and overcome them, and learn from similar local projects. Alternatively, if you've learned really great lessons from your own project, you can have a think about how you can share them with other members of your community. And finally, when you're looking to apply this to your own project, you can think about what is the solution. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on the people and the specific elements that are important to them. Again, I said at the start about kind of changing that language depending on what's important to your tenants. If it's things like fuel poverty and lower bills, make sure that's a kind of vital part of your story. You really want to use your network, again, community groups and local peers, and make sure that you're learning from others. This doesn't mean necessarily, copying everything that they've done and how they've gone about their project, but to really learn from the experience of other people and the people that have come before, especially if you're kind of very new to Retrofit and you don't already have that kind of blueprint within your organization. It's important to think about kind of mitigating some of the potential problems before they arise. Again, learning from lessons learned in your own project, any lessons learned from similar projects, or just having a think about what some of those blockers would be, and how you'll go about tackling them. You can think about some of the support networks that are available, but above all, you want to really focus on telling your story. So what is the project, who is involved, and how are you going to do it? So it's got here, focus on people, leverage your network and learn from others, anticipate issues, use support systems, and above all, tell your story. And so, when thinking about your story, So this one's one I would suggest kind of screenshotting and coming back to you after this presentation to have a think about. So you can look here at kind of writing your story using the elements that I've put before. So you want to kind of set out a really clear plan. You want to identify the characters and cynics and also the solutions. You want to create a kind of clear, concise, and convincing storyline. So again, going back to the kind of elevator pitch, if you were, pulled into a senior meeting and have to talk about why your project's worthwhile, why it should kind of continue to get funding, would you be able to do that? Would you be able to do that on the fly? To kind of have this in your back pocket for a variety of audiences as well, because a story will very much change depending on who you're kind of delivering it to. And I think we go into a bit more detail about this here. So again, when you're selling your story, you want to make sure that you're telling the story to everyone that needs to hear it. So not just when you're asked for, but for kind of all levels of your organization and to all stakeholders. You might have a slightly different story depending, as I said, on whether this is kind of an internal or an external story. But you really want to make sure that you're also targeting at all levels of your organization. So when you're going to talk to senior leadership, it might be, what's the bottom line? How much is it going to cost? What's going to be the outcome? When you're talking to colleagues, they're going to be wanting to know a little bit more about what this means for them, and how will this impact their kind of day job, and how can you make this easier for them. You really want to gain as much support as possible. Again, having support from senior leadership is always useful in pushing forward projects, but really making sure as well that your colleagues are on side. So things like if you're a sole sustainability person working within your organization, there might be data teams, there might be asset management teams. They all could be involved in your project, and you want to make sure that they're on side. You'll find that a lot easier than when you dump on a project on them a few months later and tell them that it's their job to complete it. You want to make it as convincing as possible, and including some of the elements that we've put in earlier, to really show what's important to the story, who it impacts, and what the outcome's going to be. And you can use this to kind of drive engagement. But the main thing is really sharing your passion with others. I mean, I'm going to assume that if a lot of you are on this call, it's because storytelling to do at your organization. Your kind of day job might be sustainability or housing or retrofit projects, but not everyone else might share your same enthusiasm. So you want to see how you can kind of pull them into the excitement that you feel about the project as well. So we've got a few additional resources here that we'd recommend kind of checking out when you're looking at pulling together your story for housing retrofit. Oh no, these are some of the upcoming events I got ahead of myself. So we've got a few upcoming events here. We've got themed around kind of procurement, governance. We've got resident engagement calls, which I think I'm going to be supporting with, and then also how to get to EPCC. So especially, as I said, a lot of you will probably be looking to mobilise for your warm homes project within, or very imminently. So if there's any of these that you feel you'd benefit from a refresh or are quite new to you, we'd recommend checking out the resources. And also we've got lots more on-demand resources. So there's a lot of kind of presentations, there's toolkits which are amazing. There's lots of really great content on the website. So if you want to do a bit of a kind of deep dive into any elements of retrofit, there's probably some resources for you. So recommend having a look on the website. I think Christina might have shared some links a little bit earlier. And that's it for today's presentation. I will hand us back to Christina.
Thanks, Abby. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And in fact, thank you, Abby, for a very, very insightful session. So, yeah, thanks all.